Hello, folks. Welcome back to World War II TV and another double bill day. We have a show later today in our ongoing Monte Cassino series. We're looking at camouflage smocks worn by members of the British 6th Armoured over there. But this show now is the first of a new ongoing series where we look at museums, both large and small, across the world, and talk about with their staff about what they're trying to do and the history of the museums themselves. So today, Doug Henderson from the Gurkha Museum in the UK is here to talk about the history of the regiment in World War II and the work done at the museum. So I'll bring him in now. Morning, good morning, Doug. How are you today?
Good morning, Willie. I'm very well, thank you. Thank you so much for having me on and having us involved in this. This is great.
No, great. So we were talking before going live about the problems in 2024 with that museums face around the world with budget and things like that. But before we get into the kind of the heavy stuff and the Gurkhas, tell us about yourself and how you got involved in the museum and what your primary role is there.
Yeah, no problem. Well, for my sins, I'm a civilian, so I have a museums background rather than a military one. I started off, it's the story. I always want to say there's some deep connection between myself and the Gurkhas, which is what's led me here. The truth is almost disgustingly prosaic. About 7 years ago, I was working in a collections role in the Aston Martin Museum in Oxfordshire, which is a tiny little place, little barn, not really fit for purpose. And I had a partner who lived in Bournemouth at the time, and I really wanted to be able to live with them. So I looked for jobs further south, and this one came up. And as so often happens, the partnership went away very quickly afterwards, but the job has stayed. And since then, I have been in the collections role here at the Gurkha Museum in Winchester. So initially, that was as a collections officer, and that's progressed to assistant curator. Basically, all the collections aspects of the museum, from both external stuff like this and like exhibitions to conservation as best I can, care, support, and engagement. So quite a broad brief and a lot of plates that we spin, but it's never a dull day.
Yeah, and I think you've touched on something I want to bring up later on, is that the widening set of responsibilities that a museum director curator has to be involved with these days. It used to perhaps just be dusting the cabinets, and now there's this whole social media and outreach and community side to things, and also we know a hell of a lot more about preserving things than perhaps we did 200 years ago, where people just got screwed, bolted straight through artifacts onto walls and things like that. So the remit of a museum is complicated, but we can talk about that later. So the Gurkha Regiment, it's going to be one of those subjects that people in Britain and Nepal know a lot more about than perhaps people around the world. And, we've been doing our Monte Cassino series where we've been emphasizing the international nature of that campaign. And you list the nations, and some people reading will read the Gurkhas without necessarily understanding how they come to be there and who they are serving with, and are they independent? Are they part of the British Army? So, we had Tim Gurung on 3 years ago now, folks, talking about the role of the Gurkhas from the Gurkha point of view. But Doug, take us through the kind of the basic, long-term history of just exactly how the Gurkhas ended up serving alongside the British or with the British, and talk about some of the definitions.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, well, in brief, it dates back to the early 1800s. So prior to about sort of in the early 1810s, 1800s, as you all know, the East India Company, the British East India Company, controlled huge swathes of northern and eastern India at this point, which led to us basically controlling the border between the relatively new country then of Nepal, which had its origins in the middle of the 18th century. It was relatively new, very dynamic, had a large army, and was expanding. So this led to border clashes. And in 1814, the East India Company sent 4 columns of troops north into the territory then controlled by Nepal, basically in so far the first and hopefully only Anglo-Nepal war. There was some serious clashes early on, dragged on for about 2 years, and over the course of those 2 years, both sides sort of learned a lot more about each other and realized the dynamics of it both involved. At the end of that conflict, we signed a treaty with Nepal, the Treaty of Sigorli, which sort of formalized for a long time the border between the two nations and regularized the system of recruiting. Because even prior to that treaty, about a year before, in 1815, some of those younger British officers who'd been present during the initial invasions had gone to their commanders and effectively said, we want to raise our own units of these Gurkha, as they were, Gurkha soldiers. The name comes from the city of Gurkha in northern Nepal, which is where the original king of Nepal was originally from. He was king of Gurkha and then expanded to become king of Nepal. So his army was the Gurkha army, which was then anglicized as Gurkha later on. So we date recruiting from 1815. So we don't conquer Nepal in that sense. It's never brought into the empire. It does remain independent. It has a lot of protection from the UK, and there are a lot of serious sort of political roles there, but it remains functionally independent. And so Gurkha troops are not technically Commonwealth. They are recruited in the British Indian Army at the time, as it was, well, the East India Company's armies, then the British Indian Army, but they are recruited under their own sort of terms. So they are weirdly separate in that way. But so that goes on. That starts in 1815 and has gone on with a number of different changes, but effectively under the same kind of principles since then.
Yeah, as I said, it can get a bit complicated there because it's kind of an example of, and yet an exception to, in some ways, the British Empire and what's going on around the world, because there's different levels of engagement, shall we say, with indigenous peoples around the world, and the relationship with the Gurkhas has just sort of steadied all the way through, as being an example of great comradeship and friendship. And obviously that's part of the remit of the museum now, is not just the military aspect of this, but this deep ongoing cultural, societal connection between two peoples of very, very, very different backgrounds and regions of the world.
Yeah, very much so. And as sorry.
So I was just saying I didn't really end that with a question. Really, that was a bad host moment there. But
That's
the remit of the museum. Let's go back to that again, because you're trying to cover all angles. You're here primarily to talk about World War II, but to understand World War II, you kind of got to take us through the earlier stages, because it's all part of this organizational aspect. So take us up to from 1939.
Yeah. Yes. So as I say, the early stages of Gurkha service, they are under the forces of the East India Company, which, as we know, is the private company, Amazon on steroids, if you will, sort of managing things out in India. That obviously is eventually taken over by the British government, the British Raj, as it becomes. And so by 1900, you have 10 regiments of Gurkhas. They are separately quartered across northern India, usually in their own permanent cantonments, which is quite unusual for the Indian Army at the time, under the administrative term, the Gurkha Brigade. So you hear the term Gurkha Regiment thrown around quite a lot. That is technically not correct. It was a brigade under which there were several regiments, apart from very briefly in 1948-49, when the first units to come to the British Army officially were called the Gurkha Regiment, confusingly. So by 1900, you have these 10 regiments. They are all infantry. They're not specialized as such, although you do occasionally get individuals from Nepal who filter into the rest of the Indian Army. And then that carries on. They see a lot of service during the First World War, where they are deployed for the first time into combat into the European theatre and wider. Not for the first time ever. There's some earlier ones. But then sort of by the end of World War I, you've had over 90,000 Gurkhas have served. And so there's a huge, it kind of reaffirms things for a long time. And then that numbers slowly drop after World War I. And then by 1939, you have sort of the final period of the British in India. There's a lot of work on the northwest frontier, stabilizing things, keeping things secure. And a lot of in the interwar period, a lot of the Gurkha regiments especially very much cleaved to their traditions, because so many of their officers and soldiers were killed during World War I, which is not an unusual story. So there's a real sort of sense of, the high Indian Army at the time. And then as soon as World War II breaks out, Nepal pretty immediately declares war on Germany as soon as they declare war on us. Because at that point, Nepal does have a monarchy, but since the 1850s-ish, the power in the country has very much been in the hands of the prime ministers. So the monarchy becomes more and more a ceremonial figurehead. The prime ministers are the ones who end up exercising real power, perhaps comparable or analogous to the Japanese shogunate in some ways. And then from the 1850s up until 1951, power in the country is held by one family, the Rana family, who make the prime ministership hereditary. And so by 1939, it's another one of those great nephews of the initial Jang Bahadur Rana in the 50s. And so that power is held by them, and the alliance is still gone. It's been updated a couple of times. Nepal's independence has been fully confirmed. And then the stage is basically set for Nepal to support Britain in its operations early on. which it does massively.
Yeah, we can get into that. So, kind of, how does the Gurkha role kind of compare with that idea a lot of us watching this will have of the British Army in sort of the late 30s, where you have the kind of the home battalion based in York or Aldershot or Colchester, wherever it be. Then you have the overseas battalion kind of doing that policing work. I mean, lots of people watching this, it's already come up. Our lovely friend Norma is saying the Gurkhas are an actual elite force. These guys are incredibly tough and brave. And that's the idea a lot of people will have today. But how does the British Army consider the Gurkhas in 1937, 38, 39 leading? Are they kind of an asset? Are they sort of a burden? Do they know what to do with them? How would you kind of classify how they are, entered into the Orbat, so to speak?
Yes, certainly even by that point, the Gurkha regiments are seen as very much exceptional within the Indian Army and wider. They've already developed this reputation. As I say, they have certain privileges and sort of positions where that most of the rest of the Indian Army doesn't get. Yeah. And certainly amongst the sort of officer viewpoint in the Indian Army, to become a Gurkha officer is seen as very much sort of at or near the top of where you can end up in the Indian Army. Certainly a couple. This is not always amazingly healthy. You have certain numbers of the Gurkha battalions end up being almost monastic in their sort of dedication to their battalion above all others. But it's certainly, they already are known as a incredibly skilled and deservedly so sort of fighting force. They existed prior to World War One, but their role in World War One very much sort of solidifies that as well. So they are. It's not simply a reputation that's kind of forged in World War II and afterwards. They're already seen as pretty exceptional within the Indian Army. Obviously, that sort of has the impact later on after what happens after World War II. I think it's safer to view things in an Indian Army context up until World War II, because World War II is the thing that properly changes it. But they are much more well known after World War I than they had been previously. So
okay, thank you. So, how many battalions, how many units at the beginning of the war, and as the war progresses, and where did they serve? Take us through the kind of the basic entry level Gurkha understanding 101.
Yeah, absolutely. So if we take 1939 as basically the example, you'd have, as I say, 10 regiments of Gurkhas, and each is a 2-battalion regiment. The oldest of those would be descended from those who were formed in 1815. The youngest of those would have been formed in about 1901, 2, 3. So you've got some are relatively new, but they'd all have seen service to a degree in World War One. They're all sort of keen. They all have seen a lot of active service on the Northwest frontier, but there'd be not that many extra sort of Gurkhas in different roles, as it were. And each of those regiments would also have a singular depot, which would be broadly responsible for headquarters sort of stuff and recruiting. This system had been pushed to the limit by World War One, and then as recruiting sort of carries on in World War Two, you very quickly get new battalions raised. So by the end of World War II, every one of those 10 Gurkha battalions has either 10 Gurkha regiments has either 4 or 5 battalions in them. Sometimes it's 4, sometimes it's 5. The depot system changes. You get the regimental centre, which is a lot more centralised, a lot more. This is what's going to do the headquarters, the administration, the recruiting, and then you get extra regiments as well, because you get extra units. You get Gurkhas deployed as parachute troops within the rest of the Indian Army. You get Gurkhas trained in garrison units and support battalions and training battalions that are set up to train for these different regiments. And you get Gurkhas deployed in smaller units into what would we now call corps units. They're not officially sort of separated off as Gurkha corps units, but you have Gurkha soldiers often deployed alongside units of artillery or units of signals, and the lines become a lot more blurry. Broadly, sort of where they serve, it's a world war for a reason. They often have a finger in most of the smaller conflicts around the world in World War II, but broadly it is 3 areas: North Africa, Italy, and the Far East, what we would have then called Malaya and Burma, but which would now be Myanmar and Malaysia. Initially, sort of early on, that service is North Africa, because again, the Indian Army, it's relatively easy to deploy Indian Army forces west, because you go around the Arabian Peninsula and deploy them through Egypt. A lot of that area is still in pre-war sort of administrative lines, and sort of where the Indian Army kind of covers it and where that border is a lot easier to deploy. They go into Egypt and then fight all across North Africa against Italian and German troops up until from 1940-41 up until like 1943. And then so they're they have their ups and downs. So obviously they're there at the Second Battle of El Alamein, for example, but also the 2nd Battalion of the 7th Gurkhas is captured at Tobruk when that falls. So, which is oddly enough the second time in its history that battalion has gone into the bag. They are also captured at Kut during the First World War, which we've just done an exhibition on. So it's been unlucky for them, but so we have ups and downs. And then when that campaign finally ends in 1943, you have some high moments, like a Gurkha unit of the 2nd Gurkhas is the one that finally captures Hans-Jürgen von Arnim, who's the guy who takes over from Rommel in North Africa. And then from 43 onwards, Gurkhas are deployed from North Africa, the 8th Army, into Italy. So they completely shift from having adapted to desert fighting into really steep, pretty horrible mountain fighting. As we all know, Italy is a defender's dream. And they go into a really awful winter in 43, 44. They face pretty key. They play pretty key roles. You're talking about Monte Cassino. Obviously, I won't go into too much detail there of the Gurkha role. I don't want to get anything wrong. But famously, for example, the Gurkhas are there at the 2nd battle, I believe, it is Monte Cassino in March 44, when they have the famous Battle of Hangman's Hill, when sort of about 200 yards away from the monastery itself, you have an initial attack that goes in. The 1st 9th Gurkhas are some of those who are involved alongside the New Zealanders in Casino Town, and you have the Rajputanas and others sort of supporting them going up the switchbacks towards the monastery itself. The 9th Gurkha's history is very descriptive. It goes into detail about essentially the attack is effectively called off. 1st 9th hasn't massively got anywhere, and to make matters worse, they've lost one of their companies. And then the next morning, there's a scratchy call over the radio from A Company, who says they have managed to get around behind some of the German defences and taken up a position on this little knoll about 200 yards away from the monastery called Hangman's Hill. Can we have some reinforcement, please? And so the rest of the battalion is pretty quickly moved in, and for about 9-10 days, they are there trying to make advantage of this. And they do get scouts to the walls of the monastery, which I believe is one of the first times that happens. So they don't take it by storm. Well, later it's taken by the Poles, as we know. But they are there right at the forefront of some of these key mountain fighting battles in Italy. And then to sort of shift further east, you have, as in the Far East, so Malaya and Burma. They're there right the way through the initial Japanese attacks. So obviously, as we know, the Far East is kind of the bottom of the barrel for support and services and reinforcement for a long time before World War II. There's the thinking that Singapore will be able to project sort of naval power and prevent any Japanese landings in the region, which is incorrect. And so with the retreat down through the Malaysian Peninsula into Singapore, Gurkhas are there. They do their best as to what they can, but it leads to, along with about 80,000 other Allied troops, 3 battalions of Gurkhas going into captivity with the fall of Singapore. So they're there throughout the duration of the war. But then it almost happens in Burma as well, as the retreat goes up through Rangoon, from Rangoon up towards India. And they managed to stop that collapse happening on the same level. But in total, it's hard to say when. But if we to take, for example, June 6, 1944, you don't have Gurkhas involved in D-Day or France or Germany, but around the rest of the world, you have about 60 or so battalions or similar-sized units deployed around the world, mostly in those areas. But as I say, including training battalions, parachute battalions, garrison battalions, those ready to go into Italy, those already in Italy, those in captivity, some of those who are re-raised whilst their others are in captivity. It's a bit of a big mix.
But I think that underlines just how many of these battalions there were. And is that something that you deal with at the museum, that people are aware of the Gurkhas, but kind of think it's a few dozen guys and that's it? Does the enormity of the commitment surprise people?
It does. Like we have a fair few school groups that come around the museum, and one of the figures I usually try and sort of talk about is how by the end of World War II, over 130,000 Gurkha soldiers served just in that conflict, and every single one a volunteer. No Gurkha has ever been conscripted to fight for the UK, and everyone has volunteered to do so, for many different reasons. But that's almost twice the size of the current army in its entirety today. So it's a huge number.
Wow. And
then in total, the figures get a bit squiffy prior to 1900 because of record keeping, but it's somewhere around 350,000 have served over the past 210 years. So it's a huge number.
Yeah, I mean that's just staggering. So let's take it back to a couple of basic questions, because the recruiting, because one of the things you deal with and we dealt with when we had Tim on 3 years ago is lots of not myths so much around the Gurkhas, but information, sort of legends build, and and we know how a lot of British people, for example, got drafted. As Spike Milligan famously said, a letter turned up inviting him to go and serve in the conflict. But how do Gurkhas go from being in their villages in Nepal to serving in the Gurkhas? And what are the myths around that? So take us through the process.
Yeah, well, it's an interesting question. The process has changed a fair bit over the past 20, 30 years. Historically, it would very much be there was, and in many cases still is, a very long tradition of familial service. So you'd have a soldier would come and serve, and then their son, grandson. I think the record is 6 or so generations, maybe even more. You have long histories of generations serving. And Nepal is difficult to get around even today outside of the major cities. So historically, it would have involved long treks, usually by recruiters from the individual battalions. Things were usually done on a battalion level. They would be sent out, into Nepal to go and to the different villages, to the places, to pull these recruits down, to basically make it to recruiting heads to be assessed. If they weren't ready, weren't fit for it, they'll be given their pay to make it. Were given enough pay to make it back to their village, and that's it. And if they were, they'd be brought on. There were sort of agreements with the Nepali government. The Nepali government would recruit from certain areas for their own military. So there's certain areas we couldn't recruit from. Then there's others that we could, and those tend to be, they're referred to as East and West, but in the Gurkha regiments, West usually means sort of South Central Nepal, not the far West. And then a couple of the regiments, the 7th and 10th, notably, recruit from the far East, which shows up in the different Jat names, or the Nepali caste names that you see in a lot of historic recruits. So for most of the regiments, you'll get clan names such as Gurung, Magar, Pun, Sunwa. But then in the 7th and 10th, you will see the names Rai and Limbu come up a lot, because they're the only two that recruit from those regions. And now, more recently, with changes in Nepal, changes in agreements with the Nepali government, but also with sort of changes with things in the UK, recruiting is now a lot wider and access is a lot more. So a lot of people, most people in Nepal now have at least some access to the internet. They can see things about the Brigade of Gurkhas in the UK. They can get a lot more feel for what the process will be like. And there are now no barriers to recruiting in terms of caste, which there now used to be. So now it is, if you are in the age bracket and you can make it to the recruiting centre and apply, if you are selected, then you are selected. So it's changing the dynamic in a lot of the older regiments. That's been going on for about 20, 30 years, and it's really interesting to see how that's going to change the history of the Gurkhas going forward.
No, interesting. And on the subject of names, Trevor Sheehan is one of our Tunisia experts. He's researching that campaign all the time. So he's talking about the Tunisian Victoria Crosses there, but how do you pronounce their names? So I'll let you tackle them, if you can read that, Doug.
Yes, I can see that. As far as I can see, only one of them is a Gurkha VC. The other, Chuliram, I haven't run across that. So he's not one of ours. But as I say, I preface this with, I am a Brit. I am not Nepali. I have not spent time in Nepal, and I have a rudimentary working grasp of the language, but I am not deep by any means. How I would pronounce the first one of those would be Subadar, which is the rank. Lal Bahadur Tapa would be how I would pronounce that. But I've heard it pronounced Tapa with a short A, and there are different ways of putting emphasis on like the Lal and where the U would come. For example, the reason the term Gurkha was standardized in about 1891. Prior to that, you had a bewildering array of spellings of Gurkha. 2 O's, there's an H in there, there's a U and an O. The Indian Army now has reverted to the subcontinent spelling of Gorkha, so they have a single O. Right. So it's still, it depends on where you're from and your language approach, really.
Okay, thank you. It's a word I have to think about before I type it. I have to go. It doesn't seem to just flow out naturally. So, one of the things you mentioned there about the reputation in Italy for the mountain fighters, and I think also people would think about them being great jungle fighters, and yet there isn't much jungle in Nepal. So where did these reputations come from? Is it more based on the fact they were very, very good at the basics of just basic soldiering, basically tough, physically adept, able to follow orders very well, good at doing that stuff that is then a principle they can take these different theaters? Or is there something inherently in the Gurkha mentality that suits them to a particular type of combat? Because I'm sure people watching will think, yes, they're the excellent jungle fighters.
No, it's a good question. As you say, yeah, Nepal, I have a lot of people come in and they either assume that Gurkhas will be extremely good in Arctic conditions because Nepal is all snowy mountains, or they'll assume it'd be really good at jungle fighting because it's all jungle. As you say, it's mostly neither of those things. In terms of the jungle reputation, I have to say, although they had a lot of service in certain areas of East Asia prior to World War II, the jungle reputation almost certainly stems from World War II and fighting in Burma and Malaya, and then fighting in subsequent campaigns in the Malayan Emergency, the Borneo Confrontation, and the Brunei Revolt in the 1940s, 50s, 60s, which is because it's where most of any form of British soldiers who would have served alongside Gurkhas and sort of known them pound for pound, because they didn't see service, as I say, in France or Germany. So unless you served alongside them in Italy or North Africa, you're most likely to have served alongside them in World War II in the Far East in a jungle-y setting. So I think, and they were very, very skilled, but I think they developed a lot of those skills from those conflicts. And if you effectively spend 1941 through to about 1965 in and around sort of a jungle combat setting, or at least even a jungle sort of base setting in Malaya, which is where they were based for a long time, you are able to carry those skills on as well. So that's, I think they kept that going for a long time and were able to, as opposed to, say, the skills they would have learned in Italy because there's fewer deployments in mountain settings afterwards.
Yeah. And generally, how were they perceived by the fellow soldiers alongside? You know, we've talked about this endlessly about the casino, the numerous nations, and the same applies to the 14th Army out in Burma. All these different nations that generally came together quite well, but not without certain issues based on kind of endemic racism and misunderstandings. But from my limited understanding, it seems that the Gurkhas have had a pretty steady path of getting on well with people around them. Is that broadly true, or were there problems in World War II?
It's a fair question, and like any soldiering situation, you're always going to have issues and tension, and so I don't want to ever pretend that isn't there. But it is perhaps the tale I run across the most when dealing with families of those who serve with Gurkhas or Gurkhas themselves. Their reputation for friendliness and ability to get along with the people they find themselves with genuinely seems to be entirely based in reality and correct. Like, it seems to be. I've very, very rarely heard a negative encounter from a soldier's perspective about serving alongside or with Gurkha soldiers, and in my own experience too, some of our staff here are former Gurkhas, they're Gurkha veterans, and that holds true in my experience as well. So I think broadly that's kind of very likely to have been correct, because they're very good at adapting to the situation and taking things quite phlegmatically, and also supporting those they consider that they're working alongside, as well as having skill in whatever terrain they tend to find themselves in. So I think those tend to sort of make it easier to present quite a good front of, we can deal with the situation with a smile, or at least a positive outlook.
No, that's a good response. And I think there's a question coming up in the sidebar that I'll ask you, because one of the things we've tackled quite a few times on this channel is that when you kind of create elite forces, and I know elite is a terrible word, I hate using it myself, because what does it actually mean? But you create units that are particularly adept at the kind of the brutality of killing people. Is that sometimes when they're not directly in combat, there can be disciplinary problems, there can be problems of motive, because it is complicated training up people to be killers. And Italy, for example, had lots of problems of desertion, things like that, and PTSD. So Trevor again is asking about the disciplinary record of the Gurkhas. Is there anything particularly unique about them in World War II or around that would set them apart from your typical British Army regiment?
Yeah, I don't know whether I'd say sets them apart, because you're always going to get extreme examples of discipline under tension and pressure in almost every other unit. So I wouldn't want to claim them like that. But I mean, good examples, certainly, for example, those units that go into captivity when they're captured, and even in World War I, this held true as well. A lot of the histories speak of the units maintaining their cohesion and discipline right the way through, and seeing the value of maintaining that level of sort of support and that framework around which they can hold. There are very, very few instances of that seemingly breaking down, or of them sort of like collaborating with Japan in a meaningful way. But then you also have examples, say, E.D. Smith, Bertie Smith, a officer from the 7th Gurkhas. He served in Italy, and his book, Even the Brave Falter, is an extremely candid and good account of his time there serving with Gurkha soldiers. He writes of finding Gurkha soldiers who are sort of crouched down under fire and effectively initially refusing to go out under fire because it's scary. They're being shot at, and he has to go to them and say, "Better die than live as a coward." I thought that was the motto, and then soldiers do get up and go and do their duty. But it would be wrong and reductive of me to try and play into the narrative that of superhuman without the human context.
Yeah,
if that makes sense.
No, definitely.
I think that can be quite reductive of Gurkha soldiers because it takes away the human element, which is not.
Well, that's a really good point, because I think some of these labels that we've attributed to the Gurkhas that we intend to be complimentary are actually a little bit kind of narrowing. You know, that they're all exactly the same, and they're all these tenacious, little guys with their kukris who want to kill people, and it's well intended, as I say, a lot of this stuff, but it doesn't allow for the nuance of the fact that within any kind of military unit or organization, you get a range of different types of people with different types of motivation and different ability levels. And Norma mentioned again the fact that, and I hadn't thought of asking you this, but it's a good idea about them. Are they Buddhists? Does their faith have a connection with the way they consider life serving in the British Army?
That's a good question. Historically, Nepal was for a long time the world's only Hindu kingdom, and so every Gurkha soldier who signed up, whether they were or not, tended to put down on the form Orthodox Hindu, because it was seen as it's what was the done thing. Nepal as a country is amazingly pluralistic in terms of culture and religion. It's a beautiful, fantastic place. So that obviously wasn't the case historically, but you got very few who were down as non-Hindus. Now, with things having sort of shifted, they are still predominantly Hindu, but Nepali Hinduism is quite syncretic and quite adaptable in many ways. So you can have those who consider themselves Hindu but have a lot of sort of Buddhist take on things. You do have Buddhist Gurkhas, but they can often take in a lot of festivals or stuff that is Hindu. You have an increasing number of Christian Gurkhas, especially with those based in the UK. To take an example from my own history, for example, Nepal has, I think, the highest amount of Quakers in Asia, apart from any of the other countries, just my own experience. Weird fact. So it's a country that keeps surprising you. So, for example, in the brigade today, each unit still keeps what they call a Hindu Pandit, so a Hindu religious individual, and a Gurkha Lama, or a Buddhist Lama. So they still maintain those. So they keep both options of those open because that addresses most soldiery in the brigade, and then they have access to army chaplains as well.
Brilliant answer. Superb detail. So, kind of an elephant in the room, in a sense, is when you get to these types of units, is the white officers. You know, it comes up with the West African forces in the 14th Army generally. So, we know there were some fairly famous white officers commanding Gurkha. Tony Hart of Take Heart, when I was a kid, was famously in charge of Gurkhas for a while. But at what point were Gurkhas able to rise up the ranks themselves? Senior NCOs, sergeant majors, and officers. Was that during World War II, or was it post World War II?
That was post World War II. So historically, within the British Indian Army, Gurkha soldiers they would come in as recruits. They would be able to rise through the recruiting system as NCOs, and then often after sort of the highest point they could rise would be the Subedar Major, so effectively the sergeant major of the battalion. And then upon retirement, they could often be promoted to honorary captain or honorary lieutenant. That for a long time was the highest they could aspire to. Once things shifted, after World War II, obviously with the independence of India, the number of Gurkha units got split. 6 of those regiments remained in India, 4 came to the UK, or the UK military, and they were based initially in places like Malaya and then Hong Kong and Singapore. That then meant title changes for the ranks and things like that, and things started to loosen up. You would in dribs and drabs over the sort of 80s and then later on, you got the chances for Gurkhas to commission as late entry officers. So they could commission sort of late entry and then go in as captains and go up. And you then started to get the option for Gurkha soldiers to go in as sort of earlier on and then promote essentially as officers. Again, the big change that's happened is there's now no functional reason why a Gurkha soldier cannot rise through the ranks, commission through Sandhurst, and then rise to become the professional head of the British Army. It hasn't happened yet. There's no reason it can't. I think the highest rank we've had so far of a Gurkha is a full colonel. What we're getting, interestingly now, with Gurkhas increasingly settling in the UK, not back in Nepal, is that their families, when they settle in the UK, are then British citizens, and they are now joining the army through the traditional British way. They're joining as normal recruits, or they're going to Sandhurst to initially commission and come out as young officers, which isn't a thing that's traditionally happened. So what we're starting to get now is the initial stages of British Nepalis of Gurkha Heritage joining the army or commissioning, and then going into command as officers in Gurkha units. So we're kind of very much starting to see that as well. So it's a really interesting new cultural shift, and we're going to be interesting to see how we track that, I think.
And that's fascinating, and that dovetails nicely to what I want to talk about next, which is the museum, because with military museums, there's more than two types, but there are museums about regiments, units around the world that don't no longer exist. They've been amalgamated away; they just simply don't exist. And then there are other museums that are still representing an active serving unit, albeit sometimes changed designation. But Gurkhas, absolutely, as you've been saying, still ongoing, still continuing. The history is long. So your remit as a museum different in some ways than a museum that's tackling a unit that was disbanded in 1946 and has no legacy today. So tell us a little bit about how the museum was set up in the first place, what your ongoing missions are, what the future holds, and then we'll do a few questions as well. So the museum itself.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. So we are, as of this year, 50 years old, and in some ways we're starting to show our age. Basically, so we started out in 1974 at Church Crookham Barracks, not too far away from us in Winchester, in Hampshire. So the idea behind that is from 1948, you had Gurkhas in the British Army officially, but they were not based in the UK. They were kept out in Singapore and then latterly for a long time in Malaya and Hong Kong. In 1970s, we started to base a battalion of Gurkhas from the infantry regiments in the UK, and that was always at Church Crookham. They would sort of rotate out, which meant we had a Gurkha presence in the UK fully for the first time. That meant that when we started to talk about a separate museum, a place that would remain independent to a degree and look after the heritage, we looked to set up there, because that's a period of amalgamation and reduction and disbandment for the British Army as a whole, but especially for the brigade. There are some serious discussions about the complete stopping of Gurkha recruitment in the 70s. It nearly happens, but it's kept on. And we get down to single battalion regiments, and the core units really reduced down to pretty much single squadrons by the sort of 80s, 90s. And so we realized, well, these battalions might not always be around to look after the history. We need something that can do that. And so we start off, we have 2 barrack blocks that are empty. We're given those and basically told, that's your lot, get on with it. And so we fill those up and we stay there for about 15 years. But we sort of really get pretty packed to the gunnels, and we sort of want to move out from behind the wire, become more accessible. And so when the barracks here in Winchester, Peninsula Barracks as was, that becomes decommissioned, and the MOD is looking to dispose of the site. And so 3 sides of the square here are now privately owned, but one side and a couple of the other buildings remain owned by the MOD. So we moved in the late 80s. We opened in 1990. We were due to be opened by then Prince, now King Charles, but funny as it sounds, he fell off a polo pony the day before and broke his arm. So
how inconvenient.
Yeah, so we've been here for 34 years. So in that time, a lot of stuff has changed. So in 1990, the brigade is seen by many as almost an imperial hangover. It's still based in Hong Kong. It's not really been involved in many of the recent conflicts, with things like the Falklands and the Gulf War accepted. And it's seen is this still relevant? And there are only about 5,000 or so people of Nepali origin in the UK at that time, because most Gurkhas then settled back in Nepal.
Back home, yeah.
Now, Nepal is no longer a Hindu kingdom. It is a modern republic. The monarchy has been removed. There are now over 130,000 people of Nepali origin in the UK, mostly sort of connected to the Gurkhas. Nepali is now the second most common first language in Hampshire after English. And so the demographics have changed hugely, and the brigade has changed hugely. From a low of about 2,000 or so in the early 90s, we're now up to best part of 4,000. New squadrons are being re-raised. Completely brand new units are being re-raised. Basically, we're as strong as we've been for a long time. I say the brigade is as strong as it's been for a long time. And so our museum needs to reflect that and reflect the last 30 years. Major conflicts like Iraq and Afghanistan, but also smaller ones, deployments around the world, dealing with everything from operations to do with COVID and helping out there, to anti-poaching operations in Africa, to even ones supporting our NATO allies at the moment. the brigade has changed and become a lot more adaptable, and we need to make sure the museum does as well, because the Gurkha soldiers of today, but also those of yesteryear and those of the future, deserve it. To be honest, that's what we're here to do.
And you said, before we went live, how you consider yourself a storyteller. And one of the things I want to bring up now is maybe a British way of telling a story is inherently different to a Nepali way of telling history. And I'm thinking about the reading I've done about Native Americans and how they shared their history by, cave paintings or passing on the counting of the coup on the teepee side. So I'm assuming as things are moving, you're now looking to tell the story the way the Gurkhas want the story to be told, which may not necessarily align with the kind of a conventional British museum. Tell us how that, the cultural differences of just how you share stories.
That's very, very true. It's something we are aware of. The written history of the brigade has in many ways been that of the British officer, because culturally things are not written down as much, and a lot of the Gurkhas were not asked about their take, which is a great shame. Now, so when we want to update the museum, we are trying to make sure that we take in ideas and opinions and backgrounds from all of the museum stakeholders. So we are engaged in what we call Project Qaida. Qaida is a word that doesn't really translate directly, but it's probably best translated to ethos or method or way of doing things. It's a word that sums up the history and the heritage and the approach of Gurkha soldiers in the army today. And so we are looking to use that as the banner for our redevelopment. As part of that, we are absolutely, I'm aware I am not a military person. I'm a civilian. My background is museums, but I have not served with Gurkhas. I'm not from Nepal. My instinct and how I display things is going to be different, as will every single other one of our staff. But we are trying to adapt in different ways. So we have a staff of about 12 at the moment, of which 3 are full-time former Gurkha soldiers. Our director is not a Gurkha himself, but he's a former lieutenant colonel in the engineers. We have our head of fundraising, who's a former signals officer and whose husband is a officer in Royal Gurkha Rifles. So we have a huge amount of, we try and make sure we balance things out. And our board of trustees also has representation not only from serving Gurkhas, but from former officers. And from one of our trustees is the wife of a former Gurkha and served in the military herself in the Queen Alexandra's Nursing Corps.
Right.
So we're trying to make sure, and with veterans communities, with local sort of Nepali communities, as well as the former soldiers and the officers, we're very much trying to ensure that we do our best to miss things out, do our best to not miss things out. Because previously, questions were not asked that it would never have entered the heads of those 30 years ago, perhaps, to have asked those questions. We won't get everything right, of course not, but we want to try and make sure that the story that is told is much more equal and accurate to the Gurkha soldier and their officers and everyone else who serves, and their families as well, than would necessarily we'd be at risk of doing if we didn't try and take it properly seriously. And
this is where
I wish there was an easy answer I could give.
I completely understand. I mean, we're going to be having a chat with a curator of an armored vehicle museum at some point in the future, and that, in some ways, is a simpler set of problems, although he probably would argue and say, no, it isn't. It's very complicated. It's about maintenance. It's about getting spare parts. But you're dealing with military history, social history, the topics that are sometimes uncomfortable to talk about in this day and age, empire, race, faith. There's a lot of threads and themes running through this, alongside the people who come in and say, that's the wrong bayonet on that there for 1883. You're dealing with the general kind of military buff as well. So I'm assuming, we said at the beginning, a lot on your plate as you go forward with dealing with all these things.
Yes, I mean, I've just noticed a question in the chat. For example, do Gurkhas visit the museum as part of their training? Yes, they do, and our director is now currently, as I speak, giving a lecture to some of the recruits this year. They come down every year. They come and go around and see it. So we try and engage with them as best we can. I wish I could say. I don't wish I could say it was easy. To be honest, it would be boring. It's the most wide-ranging museum I've ever worked in. Probably one of the most wide-ranging ones I ever do. It's never a dull day, but we're very fortunate, and we can adapt to military stuff, but also huge amounts of cultural material, huge amounts of what historically might have been called ethnographic material. It allows us more of a broad base as a military museum than I think most other museums can have. And we're very lucky in that regard. It lets us try new things.
It's about seeing these things as a positive rather than negative. You going forward, you will have lots of opportunities to have multicultural exhibitions and discussions about these complicated subjects, where if you are just a tank museum, again using that example, you can only talk about tank warfare to some extent, whereas you've got opportunity to bring up some subjects that are very important as we move forward into the 21st century, about our origins and our shared ancestry and our different ancestries, etc., etc., etc. But we've got a few specific questions about the museum. So Ian Carr asked ages ago, does the museum cover both British and Indian Army Gurkha units?
Good question. We do, up until the end of the British Indian Army in 1947-48.
Right.
So we cover the history of Gurkha service to Britain. Historically, that would have been phrased as to the British Crown, which I suppose is technically more correct because of the East India Company. But I suppose it's more of an applicable phrase to say to Britain. So those who still serve in the Indian Army, they're recruited under broadly the same lines. They're recruited under the same agreement, known as the Tripartite Pact between us, India, and Nepal. But they're not recruited at the same site, and they're recruited a different way.
Right.
So their history splits off then, and they've re-raised previous Gurkha units. They've got, I think, like tens and tens of Gurkha battalions in the Indian Army now. Their history has gone on to be their own. And it's a very interesting history, and we're intertwined. But our museum doesn't cover the Indian Gurkhas since 1948.
Right. Okay, and kind of connected, as Andreas is asking, is there a brother-sister museum in Asia? Do you have partners over there in that part of the world?
Yes, effectively. So we're not officially sort of partners in that sense, but there is a Gurkha Museum in Pokhara, one of the second cities of Nepal, which is where the British recruiting camp in Pokhara in Nepal is based. So the museum is just outside the camp there. Pokhara itself is a beautiful city. It's right on one of Nepal's most beautiful lakes. It's worth going. And yes, so there is a museum there. We don't share a board or funds in that sense, but we have connections with the curators out there. They do their own thing, but we try and support where we can. So yes, that does exist.
Okay, and Darren Little, who's got relatives who fought in most theatres, you talked about the fact there were parachute elements of the Gurkhas, but commandos as well. So Darren is asking, are there any commando artifacts relating to Gurkha history from the Second World War?
Oh, good question. It's difficult to sort of define them in that sense. I mean, the closest that you could say Gurkhas probably got to, like officially, that we know getting into commando units would be their role in the Chindits, I think, which are not a commando unit as such, but there's a huge overlap in terms of ethos and things like that. So we do have artifacts from that period of Gurkha service in World War II. So the famous Chindit flashes, the Chinte. We have lots of some of the reports and details. The diaries from former Chindits are fascinating. And things like, we're always looking for extra artifacts like that. Like, for example, a while back we got an interesting badge that was one of the we're not sure if it's genuine or not, but one of the badges from the Nazi German attempt to have an Indian Legion. So they had their badge had the Indian flag with the tiger on it and that sort of thing. And then other sort of Chindit related stuff. So nothing directly from Wingate, but then obviously people like Mike Calvert, not a Gurkha, but an engineer who worked with Gurkhas themselves. And I suppose the key ones we have from that, we have the Victoria Crosses there were 4 Victoria Crosses awarded to Chindits, 3 of whom were either Gurkha officers or Gurkhas. Of those 3, we have 2 on display in our museum. So we have the connection there. And they are displayed together on the proviso that they always be displayed together, because that's what the families wanted. So they're still there.
Yeah. And I think my last question is going to be, you talked about it earlier about the fact that a lot of the official regimental history is going to be written by the British officers, and so you can't go back in time now to, I don't know, 1920 and interview the Gurkha First World War veteran to say, tell us your experiences. And this is the ongoing problem, as people like Robert Lyman and others want to broaden out our understanding of units like the 14th Army and the multicultural aspect of Italy. But you can't invent archives that don't exist. You can't go back in time. Tim Gurung, who was on 3 years ago, he traveled around Nepal, and I think he interviewed 23 or 25 Gurkha veterans. I think 3 or 4 of them were World War II, but that window's closed now. You can't even do that now. And so I'm not going to say it's frustrating, but not being able to go back and get more voices from the Gurkhas themselves. Are there any hopes you have of finding a treasure trove of oral history somewhere, or how do you balance that problem of you can't go back in time?
Yeah, it is frustrating. But then I try to be a bit phlegmatic about it, because there'll be museum practices that I'm doing now that in 30, 50 years my subsequent curators will curse me for. So we try and stay as best we can. But we are engaged with the oral history, especially. We are engaged in that to try and make sure that doesn't happen going forward. So, for example, the last year, our director and our digital officer went out to Nepal to basically go and get as many of these stories from a couple of the regiment's soldiers as we could, some of whom were still of World War II era. But again, especially focusing on Malaya and Borneo, so trying to get those campaigns as well. And even about 2 years ago now, on the anniversary of the Brunei Revolt in 1962, we invited as many of those soldiers who were still around as we could to come in, sit down, and just have a dinner, have a chat, and recorded bits of it. So we have hours-long logs, all in Nepali, of recording from them talking about the revolt, their involvement in that revolt, that kind of detail. So we're working on getting those sorts of things translated. So we're kind of trying to build it in as we go forward. I noticed in the chat someone mentioned IWM audio records do include Gurkhas. Best one's probably JP Cross, Colonel John Cross, who's a bit of a living legend. He's nearly 100. He's a former Gurkha officer of 1st and then 7th Gurkhas. Led the Gurkha Independent Parachute Company in the 60s. Now lives in Nepal, speaks about 15 languages. He wrote a book called Gurkhas at War, I think, where he collected a lot of the audio history and audio recordings for that. That's probably the standout example. I can't think of any others who've done levels to that degree. So some of those are recorded, and we have copies of those as well. Going further back than that, or going back in time to get those, is not really something I'd be very surprised if there were audio recordings earlier than that. We have some written accounts, very few. I mean, the one from World War I that jumps out is we have the written account that was in a regimental journal about one of the Gurkha soldiers who served with T.E. Lawrence's camel raiders in West Arabia at the end of the war. Because there were, very briefly, about 30 Gurkhas from the 3rd Gurkhas who were sent out to train to ride camels and then were there for the operation. And somebody in the 50s, I want to say, had the bright idea to go and write down this Gurkha's story for a regimental journal. So, but it's sort of points of light like that in a darkness going further back, unfortunately, because the tradition has been a lot more oral amongst Gurkha soldiers and in Nepal in general, rather than written down, and a lot of the history was just viewed very much from a sort of officer's mindset. And if a Gurkha soldier goes back to Nepal to settle, and after his service, by the time they're remembering things and looking back fondly, there was no one around necessarily to record it for posterity, which is a sad thing.
Yeah, no, it is. And but to kind of end on a kind of not a lighter note as such, but myth busting. The public that come through there, and I always say the dangerous people are the ones who know a little bit, but what they know is wrong. The people who know nothing at all, they're great. They're a blank canvas, and the experts, they're great because they've read. But the ones who kind of know a bit, but it's what are the couple of the biggest misconceptions you get where you have to kind of correct people, say no, that's not really true? Are there a couple of standouts?
Yeah, there's a few that crop up that always surprises me. Obviously, one is that whenever a kukri is drawn, blood must be spilled on the blade before it is resheathed. This we hear time and again. Given the fact that the kukri is a tool as well as a weapon, and it's not simply a weapon, it has great significance, can often be very ceremonial, but is found all across Nepal and bits of northern India. So if someone did that every time even if they nicked themselves every time they wanted to use a kukri for work or for clearing a path, digging a space, they'd be in serious danger of collapsing from loss of blood, and it's just a risk of infection. So in service, that's not something that's going to be it happens every time. I can certainly see Gurkha soldiers using it as a useful myth to encourage the sort of ferocity, the distance, and also if you've got a British soldier asking every 5 minutes, can I see your kukri, because no one else is carrying them, then I can see it's a useful, no, I can't take it out. So I can see that being bound up. But yeah, so that's one we get asked. It's a very long-standing myth, but it's not something that has ever been like policy, if you like.
Yeah.
The other interesting one we always get is my grandfather served with the Gurkhas in the Korean War. That's a big one because, as far as we know, it's one of the only major conflicts in World War II where Gurkha soldiers did not deploy when that war was hot. So it always surprises me, and I always wonder where that comes from. But they sort of deploy in all of the others, and have since been in the United Nations Honor Guard in Seoul since,
right?
But not during when it was warm. Yes, that's a couple of the big ones. As I say, there's always a lot of that kind of thing, but it's the mythology is part of the Qaeda in many ways as well, and it's kind of
well, it brings people in,
and
we're going to do a whole series at some point on the channel about how sometimes reputations in World War II were given to people by the enemy or other units, and sometimes they started off being seen as a negative, and then they were actually claimed by the unit and taken on moving forward, and how complicated nicknames and reputations are. And I'm thinking, as an Ipswich Town fan, we were called tractor boys as a negative, but now Ipswich Town fans use that as they've reclaimed it and rebranded it, and you get that a lot with devils with forked tails and the various things that came up in World War II about airborne forces. Is that it starts off one way and then becomes adapted, and the cookery and the fighting life is something that I think is kind of, it's both a negative and a positive at the same time, depending on how you frame it.
Yes, absolutely. It happens throughout conflict, throughout history, and it's one of the miracles of language. And especially if you add other layers of cultural difference and that kind of thing, it builds up and it builds up, and it makes a beautiful collage of unique bits of history. That's why from a historical perspective and a cultural one, having the Gurkhas still in the British forces is wonderful. It adds to that kind of thing. It really does. Yeah.
So one last question from viewers. Trevor is asking, does the museum hold World War II documents available to researchers?
Yes, good question. So the museum does have an extensive archive and library. We do offer a research service. Sort of broadly, the best records we have are probably sort of World War II, World War I onwards. It depends on the regiment. It depends on the unit. It depends on what records were kept. As you can imagine, those that stayed in India kept the majority of their records. So we have much fewer details for them than we would for the 2nd, 6th, 7th, and 10th Gurkha Rifles who came to the UK. We do have sort of research archives. We do offer a research service. It's available through our website, and researchers can contact us to book use of our library or research space. We'd love to offer both those services for free. Unfortunately, as a charity and in the middle of our redevelopment, we don't, so there are fees for that. Those fees are reduced for those who are friends of the museum. We do have documents. It depends on what your area of research is going to be, but we can always see what we have and go through that.
Well, that's a brilliant way to end it, because as I said to you before we went live, I want to try and promote museums that have not so much an open house policy, but a policy of we're here to work with people and be accessible and link the link to the website is in the description below, folks. And it's important that we establish these links, and historians work alongside museums and the public, and that it's moving forward. It's essential. So, Doug, we will end the things there, but we will bring you back later in the year for a deeper dive on Italy and the aspect of the Gurkhas there. But it's been absolutely fantastic talking to you. I'm really hoping this kickstarts something where we can talk to more people like yourselves from their various museums, big and small, around the world, because it's about engagement, and that's what museums should be doing. So, have you enjoyed?
Absolutely. I just want to say thank you very much, and thank you all for tuning in and listening. It's been incredibly enjoyable. I'd love to come back.
Brilliant. We'll see you again. So, folks, I'm back again later. But in the meantime, enjoy the rest of your Wednesday. I will see you all in a few hours' time. It's Paul Woodadge for World War II TV saying thanks, everybody. Cheers. Bye.